Hello and welcome back to Photoshop CS6 for web design. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about using color in Photoshop. It's a pretty straightforward process, but there's a few things we need to understand, and Photoshop CS6 has some really cool new features that can help the web designer when putting together designs and coming up with color schemes and things like that. So the first thing I want to point out are the color selectors in the toolbar on the left. Down here near the bottom, we see we have two color swatches, one on top of the other. The one on the top is the foreground color. The one on the back, obviously, is the background color. We can change either one of these colors by clicking on that color selector, and then we get this color picker. The color picker is very intuitive, very easy to use. To change the hue that you're looking for, we can simply change this slider here, and then to change the color, or the darkness or saturation, we would drag left, right, up, and down. So dragging down increases the darkness, and dragging to the right increases the saturation of the color. And it's pretty easy to get used to using this, and this is usually my main source of playing around with color and trying to figure out what colors I want to work with. I usually use this particular color picker to do that, and it's a very handy tool. Now by default, you'll notice that the H slider here is the one that's selected. That's for hue. The HSB sliders are hue, saturation, and brightness sliders. So if we move this somewhere else, then it's going to change our color selector. It'll change the way that we select our color. I personally prefer to keep it on hue. However, if you find it easier to use one of these different methods, then by all means go for it. It's just a different combination of moving our darkness slider here up and down and moving the cursor around inside the color selector area. We also have the RGB sliders, which to me are really difficult to use unless you already know the RGB value of the color you're looking for. And then we have the lab color mode, which offers a different way to select your colors. And then for CMYK, you can enter in percentages down here. I'm going to keep it on the hue selector here. And one more thing I want to point out is that we have our hex values down here at the bottom. These are the values you'll use in your CSS and your HTML in order to change the color of your text and things like that. So these are the values you would use in your web design. Now, one of the new features of CSS, which makes this really cool, is that you can copy and paste these color values from a text file and paste them into your color picker here, which obviously isn't new. But the new thing is that if we paste it and it has the pound sign in it, and we paste it like that, it will still be able to read the color just fine. In older versions of Photoshop, if you had the pound sign or the hashtag there, then it wouldn't read the color properly. But now we can actually paste that in with everything else and it looks just fine. Also, we can now use short codes. So instead of, let's say we have a value of BB8822, we can use the short code for that, which is just B82, and it will give us the same result. So that's one of the new features of Photoshop that's friendly to the web designer, that helps us to maybe save a little bit of time whenever we're jumping back and forth between HTML and CSS files and Photoshop. But when you're selecting your color, let's say that we want some kind of medium red color. Click on OK. You'll see that it selects that for the foreground color in our color swatches here. And we can click on the background color and choose a different color the same way. At any time, you can swap the foreground and background colors by clicking right here on this two-sided arrow, and that will swap the foreground and background color. You can also swap them by hitting the X key on the keyboard, and that will swap them back and forth. If you want to go back to the default black and white colors, hit the D key on the keyboard, and that will switch it back to black and white, and then again you can use X to swap those back and forth as well. Now, if you ever want to fill an entire layer with, for example, your foreground color, you can do that using some keyboard shortcuts. You can do it using the Edit menu by going to Edit, Fill, and then choosing foreground or background color. But there are some great keyboard shortcuts that make that a little bit easier. With black selected as our foreground color, for example, I can hit Option Delete or Alt Backspace if I'm using a PC, and that will fill whatever layer we have selected with the foreground color, which was black. If we want to fill it with our background color, on a Mac we would hit Command Delete, or on a PC, Control Backspace, and that will fill that layer with our background color. Now, when you're drawing vector shapes, your color selection process is going to be a little bit different. And the way we would do that is, let's say we wanted to choose the rectangle tool, as we have here. You'll notice that we have at the very top of the screen, we have color selectors for the fill and the stroke. If we click, for example, on the fill, we have a number of swatches that we can use here, or we can create our own custom color by clicking in this color selector icon in the upper right hand corner. So if we click on that, then we get that familiar color picker that we've seen before, and we can choose our color appropriately, click on OK, and then click again in that fill thumbnail to close that, and then we can draw our shape and it will have the appropriate foreground color. Now, when you're designing for the web, you'll often have a color scheme that you're trying to stick to, and it's helpful to be able to keep those colors saved somewhere, especially if we're going to use them over and over again. So let's say that this red is going to be one of our colors. And I'm going to draw another rectangle here with a different color fill. So let's say we want this blue color. And that's one thing I need to point out. If you have a shape selected and you're selecting a color down here, it's going to change the color of the shape. So before we do that, let's hit Command Z to undo that. Before we can create a new shape with a new fill color, we can either create the shape first and then change the fill color, or we can just click in an empty area of the layer panel to deselect that rectangle layer, and then we can change the fill color. And you'll notice it doesn't affect the shape that's already on the stage. So then we can draw another shape here. And let's say, just for kicks, that we need one more color here. So again, I'm going to click in an empty area of the layer panel to deselect that rectangle layer. And then we're going to choose a third fill color and draw another shape here. So let's say that this was our color scheme for our website. We wanted to use these three colors over and over again. Well, we could just keep these squares on the stage somewhere, but that kind of gets in the way. An easier way to do that is to create some custom swatches. On the right side of my screen in my panel layout, you'll notice I have a swatches panel. If you don't see the swatches panel, you can get to that by going to the window menu and clicking on swatches. And that will open up your color swatches. And right now we see the default color swatches that appear whenever we open up Photoshop, but we can add our own swatches to that. And the way we do that is we would select one of these colors for our foreground color. So I'm going to select the foreground color to get our color picker, and we can actually, whenever we hover our mouse cursor away from the color picker, you'll notice we have an eyedropper. So if we use that eyedropper and click on one of these colors, then it selects that color in the color picker. And when we click on OK, you'll notice that that color is now selected as our foreground color. Well, with our foreground color in place there, we can now come over to the swatches panel and just click in an empty area of that panel, and it will create a new color swatch. So we can give this a name. I'll just call it CC Red, for Craig Campbell Red, and click on OK. And then let's say we wanted this blue color as well. So I'll click in the color picker, use the eyedropper tool to click on that blue color. And once that blue color is selected, we'll click on OK. And then we can click in an empty area of the swatches panel to add that swatch. We'll call that CC Blue. And then finally, I'm going to click in the color selector, use the eyedropper tool to grab that purple color, click on OK, and then we'll create that purple color, CC Purple, in our swatches panel. So anytime we want to use one of those colors, all we need to do is click on it, and you'll see that it selects it in our foreground color in our color picker. So that's an easy way that we can create some custom swatches that we can use over and over again in our file. Now there's one more really cool feature of Photoshop CS6 that I wanted to point out before we move on, and that is you can actually import color from CSS files. And it's a really handy new feature of Photoshop CS6, and the way we would do that is we would come to our swatches panel, and then there's a little drop down in the upper right hand corner of all panels, and those give you a context sensitive menu for that particular panel. And one of the things we can do with this particular menu, with the swatches panel, is we can choose a different set of swatches. And you'll see there's quite a number of different swatch sets that you can choose from. So we could choose web safe colors, for example, and we can choose whether we want to replace that or append it. If you just want to replace the current swatches, you would just click on OK. If you wanted to add that color set to the current swatches, then you would click on append. I'm just going to click on OK to replace. And it's asking if we want to save changes to our current swatches. I don't, so I'm just going to click on Don't Save, and there we go. So we have a new set of swatches that we can choose from. Well, I'm going to go back. If we want to reload the original swatches, we can just come back up here to Reset Swatches and click on OK, and it will reset it back to the default swatches. Well, we can also load swatches externally if we go to that menu and click on Load Swatches. Now, being able to load swatches like this is not a new thing, but what's new is we can now load them from a CSS file. So if you click on Load Swatches and then go to your source files folder that came with this video course, you'll see there's a file called sample.css. And before I would do this, I want to preview the file really quickly to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to jump over to my text editor, and this is what the sample.css file looks like. Now keep in mind, anytime you're importing colors from a CSS file, your CSS file is probably going to be much more complicated than what you see here. I just put this particular CSS file together to show you an example of how this could work. So I've created 3 different CSS classes: a red class, a green BG class, and a blue border class. And the reason I did this is to show you that it can pull colors not just from your text color, as we see here where we've set color equal to F00, but it can also pull colors from your background colors and your borders. So we've created a text color class here that changes our text to red. We've created a class that will change our background color to green, and another class that will change the border of an object to a blue color. So again, it pulls these colors from anywhere in your CSS file, not just from your text color declarations, not just from your background colors, but from all different sources. So anywhere it sees colors in there, it's going to pull them in. So let's jump back into Photoshop and let's open that sample.css file. Now, just to review, what we did is we came to the swatches panel, we clicked on the context sensitive menu, clicked on load swatches, and then inside the source files folder, we're going to double click on sample.css. And it might not be obvious that something just happened, but if you look at your swatches panel, you'll see we have 3 new color swatches down here at the bottom. Those are the 3 colors that it loaded from our CSS file. So as you can imagine, as a web designer, this can be a very, very powerful tool, especially if you're doing work for a company that already has several websites out there and you want to stick with their color scheme. You can just pull in their CSS files from their websites and draw the colors into Photoshop using the swatches panel. A very, very powerful tool. So that gives us enough of a background with color that we should be able to move forward pretty easily now in Photoshop and start creating some amazing designs. So I'm going to get rid of all of these rectangles that we added to our file. We don't need those. If you've been following along and doing what I'm doing, you can select these layers by clicking on the top one, holding onto Shift and clicking on the bottommost layer that you want to delete, and it will select all layers in between. And then you can just hit delete to get rid of those layers, and we're back to where we started from. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to move on. We're going to start talking about how we can create patterns in Photoshop. So we'll get to that in the next video. Thank you for watching.